The population growth module is going to be coming to you by video. I couldn't make it today, so here I am on a video screen. All right, there's a couple of basic concepts you need to understand to get into this issue, and one of those is called the Rule of 72. If you've had finance, you probably already know this, and keep in mind that it only works for small rates of growth. So just kind of show you what it is here on the screen. Rule of 72 is you take the number of 72 and you divide it by the average annual rate what something is growing at, and that'll tell you how fast it'll double. So for example, according to that rule of 72, and I'll just hold it up and talk around it for a second so you can get it down. And oh, by the way, their PowerPoint is in your learning module, so keep that in mind as you frantically take notes. It's there, and maybe you already have it in front of you so you can just annotate it. So let's say the population is growing at 2% a year. All right, so 72 divided by 2 says in 36 years there'll be 2 times as many people as there are now. And as I said a minute ago, it only works for small rates like 2% and 3% and 4%. If you had a 36% growth rate, gasp, in something, hopefully not population, 72 divided by 36 says it'll be double in 2 years. No, something growing at a phenomenal rate of 36% still will not be twice as big in 2 years. But something growing at 2% a year will be approximately doubled in size in 36 years. So that's kind of sobering. You look around and you see some growth rates of things. Seems pretty slow, 2 or 3% a year. Population growth, 3% a year. Whoa, 72 divided by 3, 24 years. It's going to be twice as many people. Well, maybe. Before I get into the possibility, let me just mention one other factor, and that is it's called the demographic transition, socioeconomic demographic transition. And basically, that says you can count on the population growth rate slowing over time, assuming that, heroic assumption at times, assuming that the economy, the country that you're talking about, the place that you're talking about, is undergoing at least some normal economic growth. And population growth rates tend to be slower the higher the higher the per capita income is, the more urbanization you have. Children are assets to a greater extent versus being liabilities at the margin in rural areas that are rapidly growing, that have lousy pension systems because parents are counting on these kiddos to survive, provide labor, and to provide them some old age support. So if you eliminate those needs, or at least attenuate those, family sizes tend to be smaller. Okay, so some people would just say, look, grow your economy. Don't worry about population growing. It'll grow as fast as people need their families to be growing for their own ends, and that'll slow down as income grows. All right, so back to the factor. Because you see, that reaction back in 1967 or 8 was one of the reasons that I'm doing what I'm doing right now. I decided to become involved in environmental studies and environmental policy back in the late 60s when I was a young man, because Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb in 1967. And I don't remember whether I read it right away or it was a year or two later. But anyway, it scared me. It was like, and there were a lot less people in 1967 and 8 than there are today. I don't remember the population of the Earth as a whole, but I know that the United States population in 1970 was about almost exactly 200 million. And our population has been growing much more slowly than the world as a whole. And now we're at 320 million. So even at the slow growth rate that we've had, there's a lot more of us now than there were then. All right, so what was the basic idea of Paul Ehrlich's population bomb that scared me into wanting to do environmental studies and figuring out, to some extent, what can we do to have fewer people and or somehow avoid this alarmist, scary outcome that Paul Ehrlich and others said would result if we kept growing our numbers as fast as we have then. Fortunately, books like Paul Ehrlich's have their effect on deciding what people do for a living, despite the fact that ultimately they prove to be completely wrong, or at least way ahead of their time, if not completely wrong. Other books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was another one that was widely read and brought a calling to arms from a lot of us at the time, young folks, deciding what to do with our careers and lives. That was shown to be largely wrong as well. So what did Paul Ehrlich exactly say that was so scary that hasn't happened? Namely, that population growth would cause us to experience famines and wars and all sorts of things. Another economist that I happened to run into for a while during my time at University of Illinois said, totally wrong. It's better to have more of us. More brains makes up for more mouths. Much better. Better way to say that is having more brains more than makes up for having more mouths to feed. And I would argue from my work in school system studies that we can have much more brain power without having more mouths, but that's something we'll talk about a little bit later and we'll set aside for the time being. Julian Simon argued that even given, he didn't say anything about the education system, but even given that population growth by increasing innovation and putting out more brains out there to figure things out would more than make up for having a more crowded Earth to cope with. All right, so I would argue that things are not nearly as drastic even now with a lot more people than Paul Ehrlich thought they were in 1967 and 68, but it depends a lot on the institutions that exist in any given place on Earth as to which of the four, I'm going to list them here, ways to view the population issue, which might be thought of at times as the population problem. So one way to view it is just that it's a source of pressure, and we may or may not be able to deal with it, and how we deal with it would affect whether it's a positive or a negative, or to what extent it's some combination of the two. Others, for example, Julian Simon would say, no, it's not a problem. Those additional brains will more than make up for the additional mouths to feed and buildings to build and roads to pave and all the rest of that. Some, I think I'd put myself in this camp, would argue that we've been dealing with it okay. Certainly a lot better than Paul Ehrlich thought we would be able to deal with it. But it would be better if there was less population growth. For among other reasons, there are some things that technology cannot fix or increase in quantity. That as they become more crowded, they change their nature. And I love wild, outdoor, natural places, and a lot of other people do. And even if you manage them optimally with price systems and peak period and off-peak prices to not put them under too much pressure, it's still, they're not the same, and the price is necessary. To do that might be awfully high. And so as a result, the people on Earth are each going to have a lot less of those experiences, even if through the price system we can maintain the quality of those outdoor experiences. So we've been dealing with it okay, but for at least some aspects of living on Earth, it might be better to have fewer people around. And it varies from place to place what the optimum, if there is such a thing, is. And we'll discuss that in just a minute. The fourth possibility is that more is not necessarily better, but it's not a problem. We can cope with it. And that's, since people should be free to have as many children as they want, that's going to have to be okay. That's not a freedom that we should even efficiently curtail, or even curtail in a non-oppressive manner by using the price system. All right, I'm going to grab a little sip of water because my mouth is, for some reason, dries out a little bit more when I'm talking to a camera rather than in front of you in a classroom. All right, there I go. All right, so what's this business of an optimum amount of population? And if you buy into that concept, that means you might be past the optimum, and then it might be worthwhile, again, at least from an efficiency perspective, which you may or may not be able to overcome from an ethical perspective. But at least from an efficiency perspective, it might be necessary to consider some of the tools that we've been talking about all semester long and apply them to the population problem. For example, if you decide that the optimum is a smaller number than the number of people you already have or are likely to have under current growth trends, then you might want to have some sort of an emission allowance market. Of course, not exactly the same thing, but the same concept. You could have a birth allowance market, for example. You could give each man and woman a certificate, just an automatic thing that you give them, one certificate, so you could call it like a replacement certificate. So man marries woman, they each have one, they can have 2 kids based on those certificates. But if they want more kids than that, then they've got to go in the open market and buy a certificate from somebody else. Well, then that individual then will, unless they go later on and buy up a certificate won't be able to have as many kids as they otherwise would have. For some reason, the screen blanked out. I think it timed out there. Anyway, here I am back. I don't know whether the camera blanked out or not, but I'm back. And so the birth allowance market is something that would function efficiently. And if you're shocked and stunned that somebody would even countenance such a thing, you're in good company. I'm sort of with you there. I'm an economist. I'm into figuring out how to fix things efficiently, and that would be an efficient way to limit the number of births to a certain number. And for example, if somebody had used up their birth allowances and then they had another pregnancy in their household, well, you bought yourself a birth allowance market at the time of birth. And it would be like a student loan sort of a deal, in that if you don't have the money to pay for whatever the market price is, it becomes a debt that you can't shed, like you can't shed student debt, student loan debt. Same kind of an idea. Again, I'm not saying that it's something that I advocate. We're not there yet, I don't think. Some people think we are. But it's something that's on the shelf as an efficient tool to limit births and therefore population growth to some chosen amount. Of course, you want to have it be at the replacement level. You need to have more than one certificate per person because people die young and all the rest. But anyway, so you could set the number at any level you want, just like for the emission allowance market. You could decide how much the emissions should be, and then assuming enforcement, that's the level it would be at, and the price would just fluctuate to cause the trades to efficiently allocate the limited quantity among those who would desire it. All right, so what are the issues in determining the optimum that somebody might want to achieve through emission allowance metaphor, birth allowance markets, or, right, you could put a tax on births, right? That would be like an emissions fee. Okay, same basic idea. The higher you set it, the fewer the number of births. Okay, again, not arguing for it, just saying it's there on the tool on the shelf as a tool that you can use to achieve an objective should you decide to do that. Now, again, so what would define the optimum population? Things like economies and diseconomies of scale, for example. Sometimes, as you get bigger, some things get cheaper to do because there's more people to support it, and so you can do some things that you couldn't otherwise do to make it cheaper per unit of output. And then this was just recently in New York. It was a great place to visit. I can understand why a lot of people love to live there. I'd even consider it. I love public transportation. I'd love to do without a car. But in the context of this conversation, there are a lot of diseconomies of scale. That's why it's so darn expensive to live there. It isn't just that a lot of people want to live there and therefore they bid up the price of things. It's expensive to pack that many people into a small amount of area and to keep it clean, the air clean enough to breathe and the water clean enough to swim in, and the drinking water comes out of an aquifer. But to keep the externalities in check so that it's a habitable and pleasant place to live. And so that gets built into the cost of things. And so, that could be part of deciding, maybe we have a few too many people. Maybe the optimum number is a little smaller than the number we have now because of all the diseconomies of scale. I'm going to hold up one of my pieces of script because I want to emphasize how important this second item is. Okay, here it is. You see all the stars there? I'm not going to stick it all the way up on the screen like I did before because I want to make sure it's up there and keep chatting about it. Institutional ability to cope with externalities. See, in case you didn't get a chance to write that down, I'll leave it up there. See, that's the big kahuna here in this whole discussion. And that's why the optimum is likely to differ from over time. If people solve these institutional problems or unsolve them, a la Venezuela, go from semi-functional institutions to utterly dysfunctional, and I'm sure the optimum population by efficiency measures is smaller in Venezuela now than it used to be. They just don't have the ability to cope with as many people as they used to, and cope is, of course, not the standard that you want to live by if you don't have to. It's no longer the pursuit of happiness with efficiency maximizing conditions because they've changed their institutions for the worse there in terms of allocating resources and getting the most out of them as possible. So, depending on the institutions that exist and the potential for adopting better institutions, the society might well be past its optimal population and say, some of these institutional problems are probably not very solvable. The politics of it is just, it's not going to happen. So maybe what we ought to do is do some things that may be more politically feasible, like the birth allowance market or the tax or fee for having children above a certain level. It doesn't have to be for the first one. It's one of the advantages of that approach over the birth allowance market is that you can say the first couple or 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, are free. Of course, they're never free, but no additional cost in terms of taxes or fees. But then, once you hit child number 3 or 4, now you're going to, maybe instead of getting a deduction on your taxes each one, now there's an additional charge on your taxes. See what I mean? So the institutional ability to allocate scarce resources, for example, natural areas. For example, if you didn't have a price system to allocate visits, say, to the Grand Canyon or Canyonlands or Arches National Park, any one of these, Yellowstone, Yosemite, these awesome places, and it was just a matter of being able to afford to drive there and pay for hotels and gas and all that, they'd have way more visits than those natural areas could tolerate without being drastically changed, maybe borderline destroyed. So you have to charge pretty high prices to keep the visits down to a reasonable level, and should charge lower in the off season and have more visits then in the off season. But if you didn't have those institutions, people would run over these places and destroy them. Okay, they would love them to death. And so, again, in the face of political struggle to change some long-standing institutions, and like some of these population reduction measures, the birth allowance market and the fee or tax on the number of children you have, those are pretty hard political nuts to crack. It might be a lot easier to change your institutions in a way that made you not have to do that. All right, so we can continue to think about benefit cost analysis, call it that, of population growth. There's that issue of brains versus mouths, right? So, that's part of it. And as I mentioned earlier, I kind of jumped ahead of my slides a little bit, from class, that I do that sometimes. An issue there in Julian Simon's notion of, more people are good, is maybe we can get that effect by improving our education system. Maybe we can get that effect of more brain power per mouth to feed or additional mouth to feed just by having more brain power per person. And it's well established on a nonpartisan basis that the U.S. K-12 system is a disaster. And people on all sides of this, of course, we disagree on what to do about it. There's plenty of partisan in that, but there's widespread agreement that we're hurting big time in terms of doing right by our young people, get them out into the real world with all the skills that $13,000 per child per year should buy, but hasn't so far. All right, so what about additional brains without additional mouths is my thought on that. Let's do that first before we say more is better. All those additional brains will make up for having all those additional mouths and cars and homes and whatever residuals from leftovers from doing consumption activities like driving your car and heating your home and all the things that we think that everybody is going to want to have done. Absolutely. Conversely, in some places the education systems aren't good like ours. It's pretty scary to have additional mouths to feed without any additional brain power or not much additional brain power. It might be that the additional mouths in a dysfunctional education system might make it so that there isn't any additional brain power to make up, even in the Julian Simon sense, for the additional mouths to feed. All right, so what are some of the key determinants or elements of the institutional factors that make it easier to either benefit from population growth or at least cope with it and have it not be devastating? Free trade, definitely be one of the ones. You see, with free trade and having worldwide markets, you can lower the cost of a lot of things by having bigger markets, economies of scale. And so that would definitely help. Free trade, fewer trade restrictions, lower prices, right? We have more total stuff for the bigger population, the less we have trade restrictions. Okay, so the countries with lower trade barriers are going to definitely be able to cope with additional people better than countries who think that that imports are a threat and that keep them out and therefore keep prices higher and specialization lower. Okay, so as I mentioned, their effective education systems are another factor in deciding how big of a population is optimal and whether additional people make things better or worse. Entrepreneurship of all kinds. I have to tell you, I'm going to use a minute or two of this video to talk to you about concerns I've had about policy changes in the United States in the last few years that I think are going to really hurt us. We passed some legislation. The two that I can think of that are especially bad are Sarbanes-Oxley back in the early Bush administration, and then so the bipartisan Dodd-Frank and the Obama administration have really put a damper on somebody's willingness, all things being equal, to start a new business. Right? I mean, we've criminalized mistakes in reporting things, and we've created a lot of regulation and hassle to be able to start a business. Between the two of them, we made it much more risky and much more costly to do that. And I think over time, this is going to be very telling, and to the extent that entrepreneurship starts new businesses and creates new jobs. And that's a big part of keeping up population growth. Well, you want to talk about having some unrest, and that's how people come out of schooling whenever they do that, 16, 17, 18, 19, if they go to college later than that, and not being able to find a job. Where do you think those come from? Not the poor people themselves. Job opportunities come from people making investments, starting businesses, and at least being able to borrow money, having a good enough plan that somebody's willing to lend them some money, or at least having maybe some collateral to back that up. We've made it a lot more risky. And so we and anybody else trying to copulate with population growth is going to do better with that, to have entrepreneurship be something that's much more attractive than it has been, than it even has been, much less where it's going with some of these new laws. And last but not least, at least for this little segment, I think I'm going to take a couple second break here after this. But the last thing to emphasize, and definitely part of anything to emphasize in a discussion of economics of anything, is the price system. We need the price system to be the big kahuna in deciding what is produced, how it's produced, where it's produced, and how it's distributed within the population, at least as a starting point. Maybe we'll want to have a safety net and make sure that even if you're not all that productive according to the price system, you still survive. Probably so. But we definitely are not going to be able to support a growing population if we maintain or increase our reliance on central planning, which means not using the price system to decide what, where, how, and for whom. Okay? I mean, it's important to understand that that reliance on the price system means decentralized planning, which means providing all the information that exists that's relevant to something in a powerful way wherever it's needed. Okay? Through decentralized planning, you harness the brain power of every participant in every market. And in the case of on the consumption side, that's for most things, or at least a lot of things, that's everybody. You can't do better than that. A central planning apparatus is based on the politically correct subset of experts that don't know much of anything when it comes to time and place specific things, which is all important in terms of efficient use of resources at times. All right, so I'm going to cut this off for just a second, and it'll be section 2 of this video that'll cover the rest of the population discussion.